Hello, this is an estate and gift tax online module. This is 5C. We're talking about the gross estate, and now we'll be looking at section 2040, and I am Professor Donna Byrne. Okay. Now, just to review a little bit, we know that transfers that take place at death are subject to the estate tax. Under section 2033, the gross estate includes the value of property owned by the decedent. And under section 2034, we don't take anything out because of those dower, courtesy, or elective share rights. Those are, whatever is included in the gross estate is still included. 2034 also had no effect on community property. And that's because community property is already owned half by each spouse. 2034 is telling us you don't do it that way when it's those elective rights. Now, in this presentation, we're turning our attention to joint tenancy, and we'll be looking at section 2040. And by the end of this, you should be able to identify property to which 2040 applies, choose the appropriate subsection of 2040, A or B, apply section 2040 to include the correct value in the gross estate, and we'll also explain some estate tax planning implications of section 24 and the effect of 2040 on basis. Okay, may have misspoken. Okay. So let's review tenancy in common. Remember tenancy in common? Tenants in common own an undivided half interest in the whole property, or third interest, however many there are. But an interest in tenancy in common can be sold, it can be devised, it can be inherited, and that's because there's no survivorship right. Let me take myself out of here. So here's an example. I think this is from your book. Mary and Joan are sisters, and they own Blackacre as tenants in common. Joan dies intestate without a will. Her interest passes to her two children, Dana and Leslie, in equal shares under intestacy laws. Now, Mary will still own her undivided half interest, and then Dana and Leslie each owns an undivided quarter interest. So that half interest that Joan had, it continues as a separate interest. Joint tenancy is different. Under joint tenancy, the co-tenants also have undivided interests in the whole property, but they also have a right of survivorship. And that means that a joint tenancy interest cannot be devised or inherited. It disappears at death. It can be sold, but that generally severs the joint tenancy and makes it into a tenancy in common. So here's an example. John and Luke are brothers. They own Greenacre as joint tenants with right of survivorship. Luke dies. Now his will leaves everything, including his interest in Greenacre, to his daughter Nancy. Well, it doesn't matter, because once Luke dies, John just owns Greenacre outright. That's what's meant by that right of survivorship. Luke's will has absolutely no effect on that, nor can it. All right, his interest ceases to exist at the moment of his death. So a joint tenancy cannot be devised or inherited. Okay? Now, if that's the case, we might be asking, so why are we talking about it with respect to the estate tax? All right? So you're right. This is not something that could be included under 2033. So if we're going to include something about joint tenancy, we need this new code section. All right, there's two parts. It depends on who the joint tenants are. 2040A is the general rule. It applies to any old joint tenants, most joint tenants. But 2040B applies to joint tenancies between spouses where they are the only joint tenants. And the rules are different. So very important first step, determine who the joint tenants are and what their relationship is. We'll start with B because that's actually the simpler rule. So B is the part that applies to joint interests of husband and wife. This is notwithstanding subsection A, so we're going to ignore A. In the case of any qualified joint interest, the value included in the gross estate with respect to such interest by reason of this section is 1/2 the value of such qualified joint interest. And then it tells us that a qualified joint interest is a joint interest between married people, whether it's a joint interest or a tenancy by the entirety. Okay, let's break this down. First of all, it doesn't matter whether the spouses are joint tenants or tenants by the entirety. So you don't need to make that distinction. In some states it's a little bit fuzzy because state law will provide extra protection for spousal joint interests. Okay, and there's, I highlighted that language, tenancy by entirety or joint tenants. Next point, half the value is included in the gross estate of the first spouse to die. Okay, so we're talking about including property that was owned as joint tenants. Note, after the first person dies, there's no more joint tenancy because the survivor just owns the whole thing. All right, but we're including half the property in the first spouse's estate. And there's the language that does that. The value included in the gross estate with respect to such interest by reason of this section is 1/2 of the value of the qualified joint interest. So third point, okay, there's no tracing. It's always half the value. That's pretty straightforward. Always half the value, and here it is. Notwithstanding subsection A. As we'll see, subsection A provides a tracing rule. Doesn't apply here. Always half the value. We don't care where this property started. So there's your 3 rules. It doesn't matter whether they were joint tenants or tenants by the entirety. It only matters that they were married. Half the value is included in the gross estate of the first spouse to die. And there's no tracing. It's always half the value. Very straightforward rule. Now, it does have some implications for basis, and I see I've got to take myself out of this. So the way Section 1014 works, that's the stepped up basis at death, it applies to property that was included in the gross estate. So here's our example. Hal and Wanda buy Blackacre for $100,000 and hold it as joint tenants. When Wanda dies, it's got a value of $400,000. Now, under 2040B, only $200,000 is included in her joint estate, right? So Hal, of course, Hal owns all of it now because Wanda died, his wife, who was his joint tenant. So now our question is, what is Hal's basis, in case he wants to sell this later? Okay, well, now if you think about it, his half of the original basis was $50,000. And now his basis in Wanda's half is $200,000. So his total basis is $250,000. Okay, compare this. What if Wanda had just owned Blackacre altogether? Well, then the whole $400,000 would be included in her estate under 2033, right? Property she owned. And Hal's basis, if he inherited the property, would be $400,000, the fair market value at the date of death. It doesn't make any estate tax difference, but when Hal goes to sell that property, it makes a difference whether his basis is $250,000 or $400,000. Okay, so that was the spousal rule. Now we'll turn our attention to the general rule in section 2040A. And here is the first part of the statute. The value of the gross estate shall include the value of all property to the extent of the interest therein, held as joint tenants with right of survivorship by the decedent and any other person, except such part as thereof as may be shown to have originally belonged to such other person, and never to have been received or acquired by the latter from the decedent for less than an adequate or full consideration in money or money's worth. Okay, so what our question is how much is included in the gross estate? Joint tenant dies, how much is included in the gross estate? All of it. That's the default rule. The value of the gross estate shall include the value. That means the whole value of all property to the extent of it was held as joint interests. Okay? So general rule, if we don't have any other facts, all of the value is included in the estate of the first person to die. But there's that second part, except such part as may be shown to have originally belonged to such other person. That's the other joint tenant. This is a tracing rule. It lets us look back and say, where did it come from? How did they come to own it as joint tenants? Did the surviving joint tenant originally own it and just sort of, give the other person a half of it? All right. Whatever came from the surviving joint tenant is not included in the gross estate. That's why it's a tracing rule. So it's not all or nothing. We can include part or all of the value in the gross estate depending on how much the survivor contributed. Now, it doesn't work to try to clean it up, right? So you can't give the younger person money and then go out and buy it together. We'll trace back to that money. Does that make sense? Yeah. But we are going to look back. So this means that it's important to have records, right? If there are no records, the default rule is include it all. All right, here's the whole statute yet again, and I think I left everything in here. I'm not going to read it out loud. You have it in your casebook, and my throat is tired. Okay, so in the next set of materials, we'll look at the Frattini case and also consider a little bit the interaction with the gift tax. So thank you for watching. It's a push me, pull you, and it says, I think we should consider switching to joint ownership. That's the right of survivorship. Yeah, I think so. More stolen art. This is a stolen Stradivarius. Thanks for watching.